What's up, everybody? Today, I'm happy to have Sam Tideman from the YouTube channel Transfigured in the Yours Truly virtual studio. The first time I encountered Sam in this space was actually from a comment he left on the ever faithful very first video I ever posted here on YouTube. In the video, I described this little corner of the internet as a metaphorical digital faith magisterium, including Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, Paul Vanderklay, and John Vervaeke, as representing leadership figures in the meaning crisis. I used the title Bishop for one of these heavy hitters mentioned, and Sam left this comment. Bishop translated into Baptist is multi-site pastor. I thought, here's someone picking up what I was putting down. As I was following the breadcrumbs of what and who was making up this little corner of the internet, Sam's channel was one of my first stops because of this comment. He had just made a channel update video, and I watched it. I also watched a few more and thought, yeah, we do share some commonalities in our background. Raised with some low church charismatic experiences with culturally fundamentalist understandings of scripture. Then I stumbled upon a core part of Sam's makeup as a believer. He was a Unitarian. At first, this took me aback as I had never really connected with a true Unitarian out in the wild before. But as I began to piece together more parts of his story and why he was hanging around this Paul Vanderklay character, popping up on Grail Country live streams, helping an estuary stay afloat over in Chicago, and hanging out in the hive mind over on Grim Grizz's Broken Clock Tower. All these places I was also being drawn to. Sam was showing me something I couldn't quite pin down. Something about faith and people, about God and man, and about those who don't quite fit neatly into other places, and how people like that, people like Sam and I, have landed here in a certain not perfectly square corner of the internet. I'm not exactly sure where our conversation will lead today, whether Sam and his brilliance will argue me out of my historical Trinitarian commitments, an argument that I know I'm actually not well prepared to go head-to-head on with Sam, or if we'll spend more time learning from one another about each other. We shall see. If this video is helpful, give it a like. If you want to keep up with the channel, hit subscribe. And if you are interested in supporting this channel, consider one of 3 channel membership tiers. Top tier members gain a voice to help build this little corner of the internet. So check him out. Here's what else I know about Sam. He has a background as a data scientist, working in healthcare and other large-scale industry, and is currently working for Google in their AI sector. Was Harvard educated, has hosted and been on some channels of other prominent figures in this YouTube space, including John Vervaeke, Trent Horn, Paul Vanderklay, Paul Antlier, Jordan Hall, and Brendan Graham Dempsey. His channel is also filled with videos that include rich cultural commentary and deep dives into church history. So go check out his channel, Transfigured. So get ready as I sit down together with Sam for some good old conversation craft here on the Yours Truly podcast. So without further delay, I give you Sam Tideman, Transfigured.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.
Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Christian.
Hey, man. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, dude. This was a long time coming as I was describing that that connection, man. So yeah, that video, it hit, people were paying attention. I don't know if it got shared on like Grimm's Broken Clock Tower or something, but different people in this space saw it, responded to it, and that kind of set me on a path I wasn't quite expecting. And you were like right there, right at the very beginning. So yeah, dude, I've been trying to nail you down. You're a busy man, obviously, as I described your life and what you're up to.
Not as busy as it might seem, but I appreciate you having patience to find a time to work me into your schedule.
Yeah, man. So I'll be honest, I was also a little nervous because I'm like, the Unitarian.
I know, I don't bite. I promise. People think that I bite or that but I'm not like some hardcore beat you over the head until you change your mind with facts and logic, unless you really tick me off. But other than that, I really tend to not do that sort of thing.
So why does it make sense for you to be kind of in this space, connected, through Paul? I'm not exactly sure how, from what I have like seen of it, how you did get connected to this space. What is that story?
Sure. It was through Jordan Peterson. How did I find Jordan Peterson? I've been like a large consumer of YouTube for a long time, probably over a decade at this point. And I loved sort of intellectual, philosophical, or religious content. And I would listen to, back like over 10 years ago, the quality and character of content on YouTube was a little different than it is now. There weren't quite nearly as many, producers of content and various kind of spaces like we have now. It was like, oh, some random professors post their lectures and lots of cat videos, and it felt like totally different in character than it does now. And I remember I was on a Kierkegaard stint. I know you've mentioned Kierkegaard favorably a couple times, and so I know that you like him, or at least wait a minute, it was one of your recent interviews. Someone was saying that they were going to send you a book. Were you talking?
That was Ken Lowry.
Ken Lowry, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he said that he needed to get you on a higher dose of Kierkegaard, and I feel like that Kierkegaard is a good thing. People, I think, feel like go through Kierkegaard phases. Some people stay there, but anyway. So I remember sometimes saying like, I don't know, 2014. And also, as you mentioned, I've been sort of a data scientist or a statistician for a while. And oftentimes that means that I'm on my computer at my desk alone doing some kind of routine data cleaning that only uses half your mind for a couple hours. And so I have another half of my mind that could be listening to a YouTube video. And so I think I searched Kierkegaard philosophy lecture or something like that in the YouTube search bar. And up pops this random Canadian professor named Jordan Peterson, who has a lecture, and it's like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. I'm like, well, I wasn't looking for the Nietzsche, but I've already watched the other top 3 hits on this search, so I guess I'll watch this one now. And well, he's a psychology professor. I was looking for philosophy, but wherever, I'll take what I can get. And I remember listening to it and being like, that was one of the best college lectures I've ever heard. I'd already been through undergrad and grad school at some pretty respectable colleges at this point. And I was like, this guy's amazing. And I'm like, oh, okay, that lecture was part of one of his courses. All right, which course was it? Okay, I'll start at the first lecture of that course and listen to the whole course.
Wow. And what year was this?
2014 or something like that. Yeah. But like, this is back when those videos might have only had thousands or tens of thousands of views.
Yeah.
And then I think maybe like I finished that was either Maps of Meaning or Personality, one of those two. And then like he starts posting the other class. I'm listening to that. And then like he posts some video about Canadian provincial politics. And I'm like, I don't care about this professor's thoughts on random Ontario bills that have no effect on me. But the YouTube algorithm kept wanting me to watch his thoughts on some random provincial bill, and so I did. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this is, and it was starting to get hundreds of thousands of views, and like, something weird's happening here. And weirder things just kept happening around Jordan Peterson, and it was like fascinating to watch. So I like to brag that I knew of him maybe only just a couple months, honestly.
Yeah.
I think it was 2015 that that sort of stuff started, that his rocket ship started taking off a little bit. And so I just felt like I was just watching a fascinating show from the sidelines. And then he starts his biblical series, and it was just like enthralling, I could say. And what did I find so, I don't know, attention capturing about it? I think I had, like you mentioned a little bit in the intro, that we grew up in a pretty fundamentalist approach to scripture. I was taught a pretty literal version of creationism. It was actually not 6,000 years ago creationism. It was like old earth, but literal 6-day creationism. Anyway, it was a slightly, my church was unique in many ways. So like we were creationists, yes, but of course we had our own flair to it. But anyway, so, and believing that evolution was a terrible conspiracy to undermine Christian faith and, those sorts of things. And in college, I had had sort of a change of heart or a change of mind on evolution stuff. I mean, I was studying biostatistics, so I had to take a ton of biology courses and evolution classes and genetics classes and all those sorts of things. And at some point, it was like, okay, this is starting to make more sense than I had been led to believe, even though when I was a teenager, I read like those Michael Behe books and other sort of high-end intelligent design sort of argument books, and was really into kind of that, you know, apologetics scene for a while. At some point, even the spell of that was breaking. But I had this huge question in the back of my mind. Well, so then what do I do with Genesis? I didn't fully deconstruct, although I had to do some perhaps minor, a renovation, if not a deconstruction of my faith. And it wasn't quite complete. And what I remember having a thought one time that was like, well, maybe those early Genesis stories are like myths, but they're like the God-inspired true version of the myths. And, you know, not really knowing how to deal with that idea or how far to take it or how to make sense of that. And then when Jordan Peterson starts talking about Genesis, I feel like he was hitting me exactly where my curiosity had sort of left off on that subject, and picking up the train of thought in a more complex and detailed and interesting way than I had been able to. And so I was, you know, a big consumer of those Jordan Peterson lectures. I would look forward to them every single time they would come out. And then in my YouTube feed up pops another recommendation. You know, what was it? CRC Pastor comments on Jordan Peterson's series, right? The gateway drug to this little corner of the internet for so many people. And so I remember watching the Jordan Peterson videos and getting the sense like, where is the Christian world? Like, there is this thing that's happening. I'm looking at the view counts. These things are getting millions of views. So somewhere out there in the world, millions of people are listening to this. It seems mostly non-Christians or people outside the realm of formal Christianity are the main people interacting and aware with this. And formal Christianity is just seemingly completely uninterested or ignorant of what's going on here. And this seems like some sort of big deal that's hard to articulate exactly what it is, but the Christians should at least be paying attention. And I like this nagging feeling that there needed to be some bridge between those two worlds. And then when I listened to Paul Vanderklay, I'm like, oh, he's the exact right guy for that job, whatever it is. You know, the man rose to the calling. And at some level, he's an unexpected person to fill that niche. And in another way, he's the exact perfect person too, right? And and so then I was a lurker on Paul Vanderklay for a while. Remember listening to early randos conversations like Job and Luke and those sorts of and Jeff and those sorts of early people. And back in those early days, it was still relatively easy to just click on the link that Paul would leave at the bottom of his videos and get on his calendar. And so after maybe a year or so of lurking, I had this growing pressure that I should probably get on and tell my story too. But I knew that my story would be a little bit of a bombshell's not quite the right word, because I don't want to be over grandiose about my own importance, but a difficult pill for many to swallow. Right. And that it would be a divisive thing. And was worried about what the reaction would be, but also felt like it was an important addition to what was happening around Paul Vanderklay. So I eventually got up the courage, clicked on the link, got on his calendar. And so I feel like I was kind of like the door, like Paul's audience was growing a lot at that point in time. And I felt like I was one of the last people to get in the door before it became a lot more difficult to do so. Yeah. And I had 2 conversations with Paul. Man, those might have been, I think those were in 2018. So that might have been 6 years ago, which is like suddenly making me feel really old. But yeah. So that's sort of the long and short of how I got here. And then eventually I decided to make my own YouTube channel. And I've been doing that for, I think, so I was on Paul's channel about 6 years ago and started my own YouTube channel about 4 years ago. I think that sounds about right.
Yeah. So what was the process like to, you said you kind of had this growing pressure and I get that. And because I've talked about like getting on here even as like kind of feel like this was like exhaling. You're like taking it, inhaling. It's like, okay, it's time. And I'm assuming that that was kind of similar when it was like wanting to
It
start.
felt very cathartic, yeah, to go on and have gotten this out there. Because I don't know if you've ever seen my original.
Actually, I haven't. Yeah,
so I mean, I talk about my story, and I won't repeat it too much, but it was basically like, as you mentioned, I grew up a biblical Unitarian. I had a lot of interaction, though, with regular megachurch evangelicalism, though. I went to Willow Creek's youth group for a while, like Willow Creek being like the archetypal megachurch. I live, in the Chicago suburbs, and went to summer camp at Honey Rock Camp, which was run by Wheaton College. And so even though I grew up in a very unique church in many ways, it wasn't like, I don't mean to over exaggerate its difference. Like, honestly, if I brought, like, you would be able to go to the church I went to growing up and be like, this feels kind of normal. There's some charismatic stuff. There's some speaking in tongues. There's some prophecy. The music's recognizable. There's a sermon about the Bible. And then there's like refreshments and casserole afterwards. It's like, I don't mean to give the impression that it was too weird, but it did have some unique theological ideas.
Yeah.
And so I kind of had a foot in both worlds of, my unique kind of biblical Unitarian charismatic thing and just larger generic megachurchdom, because my church was small and like they didn't really have a youth group and those sorts of things. They didn't have the full suite of offerings that a megachurch has. So you
outsource. You have to outsource.
Yeah. Well, my parents did, at least. I wasn't consciously making these decisions back then, but my parents wanted me to have a richer spiritual, education. And so that meant, dabbling some things here, some things there.
Well, I think that's interesting, because even that very fact that, like what are in the stack, like your parents are, we have this Unitarian distinctive, but we're Trinitarian friendly because we're going to send our kid to, evangelical church camp. Like, that says something about your formation too, and about even being a part of this space. I think like that kind of interface, and why that kind of makes sense. I didn't know that part exactly. But yeah, go ahead about getting your channel going.
Sure. So I had, in college, I was involved with a Christian fellowship, and I had gotten kicked out of that Christian fellowship and removed from leadership after my beliefs became known. And that was a very difficult, I don't like using the word traumatic for things that aren't like traumatic, physical injuries like a plane crash. But, it was one of the hardest things that I'd ever gone through up until that point in my life. And having a bunch of my best friends sort of felt like turn on me, and my status in the community that I had kind of most identified with went from very high to very low overnight, and a bunch of things like that. And it was especially weird because it's like, guys, I haven't changed or done anything. You just learned something that had been true of me the whole time.
Yeah.
And so if I was the same person yesterday that I am today, and you liked that person yesterday, but you don't like that person today, like, what's actually the truth of who I am, right? What's the true thoughts that you should have about me? Is it the ones that were sort of natural and organic over the course of years, or is it ones that are now colored by, accusations of heresy and, those sorts of things? So that was a very hard time. And that was a big part of my story. I won't repeat all the ins and outs and ups and downs of that now, but that was kind of the story that was weighing heavily on my heart that I hadn't really processed very well. And I think that going on Paul's channel was something like a weird form of therapy that allowed me to sort of process it, speak it, and have other people interact with it, and then survive the encounter in this little corner. Although there were more than a few people who came after me real hard that were high status people in this little corner of the internet that were basically trying to get me something like kicked out or humiliated or both. But that wasn't everyone's reaction, right? There were some people who were quick to defend me, like say Luke Thompson. and then there was probably a bunch of, you know, ambivalent lurkers in the middle who were just like, another Curious Randos interview with Paul, more heresy, surprise, surprise. But it was one of those things where it felt like I got something off my back that had been weighing on me for years.
Wow.
And honestly, I used to think about that part of my story all the time. And then once I had sort of processed on Paul's channel, it felt like I didn't need, like, a burden had been freed. Like, I didn't need to think about it as much. Like, it had somehow been dealt with. And so that was a very cathartic thing. And I think probably a lot of people might feel that way about their randos interviews. It's weird to explain how exactly that works, where coming on a YouTube channel, having 2,000-3,000 people listen to it, you tell your story, and it somehow feels like you know, you've accomplished something in terms of dealing with some difficulties in your life. But that is what it felt like, and I think that Paul has given that gift to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my entry into this space. But let's see here. A couple years later, I get excommunicated again from an in real life church.
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm married and have let's see here, she would have been about 1 year old daughter. And get like actual real kind excommunicated, like, you are not allowed to take communion. You're technically allowed to come. We would love you to come. No, we wouldn't. We would love you to come. Please come. Please don't ever come again. Right. Like, you know, that sort of passive aggressive, but like literal excommunication happened at a church when my beliefs came known, because I had the guts to volunteer for the worship band. So that I was like, man, I'd kind of thought this Trinity thing was handled, or, you know, in a comfortable place, right? I had processed my college story with Paul Vanderklay. I was part of a church. Things were going well. I thought I was sort of in a live and let live, you know, kind of comfortable place. And then this Trinity question rears its head again and has a very negative effect, not just on me this time, but on my wife and on my daughter. And I'm like, man, this is going to keep being an issue. I can't just think like, you know, I've processed this, I've taken off this burden, this question's kind of dealt with. And so I was like, well, so what do I do? I need to really figure out if I'm right or wrong. And like, some people I don't think believe this, but this really is true, that the main purpose of my YouTube channel is for me to learn.
Yep.
And that really is my fundamental goal. And like, I have some other interests. It's like not like every episode's about, you know, Trinity versus Unitarianism or stuff like that, but a majority are, a decent chunk are. And it really is me processing out loud, receiving feedback through the comment section and my guests and my audience in other ways. And I felt like that was the best way to try and figure out if I'm right or wrong. Is I want to, like, the Trinity is a hard thing to talk about because experts in it are kind of few and far between, honestly. Most pastors, most seminary graduates do not get taught very much about it, and that their knowledge is not much more than, like, say, a 15-minute conversation deep. And so to find specialists in the Trinity is a little bit hard. And so how do I get them to talk to me? Well, if I have a YouTube channel and a podcast, then I can at least get some of them to talk to me. And I'll throw my own ideas out there and test them in the crucible of YouTube. And that will be sort of my exploration process of trying, because I didn't know what else to do in this situation. It's like, even after I got excommunicated, I'm like, I still think I'm right, but I need to make sure I'm right, because if I'm going to be putting myself and my family through all of the difficulties associated with this, I better be darn sure. And that really was the main purpose of my YouTube channel. And I think it still remains so to this day. But then eventually, but I did it anonymously, right? I was Sam Adams at first.
Okay.
I tried to keep it difficult to figure out who I actually was.
I think that was the first, when I saw that channel update, I think that was you
coming out.
Yeah. And right whenever I was coming in onto to this space. So yeah, that's right.
Right. So you saw that my coming out video is one of your first interactions with me. So eventually I had switched churches, obviously. Well, I mean, I'd gotten shown the door at a previous church. So switched churches is even a generous way of putting it. I started going to a different church. And I had known the pastor at this other church for a long time. He was sort of a family friend, I guess you could say. And he was very welcoming. He's like, man, I'm so sorry and upset that the other church did that to you. That was rotten. You know, you're welcome here. Yeah, you can't technically become a member because that's the statement of faith level issue. But please attend, you know, play the piano in the band if you want to. Have your wife serve in the children's ministry if she wants to. We're happy to have you to the extent that you want to participate here. Just, you know, don't cause any problems intentionally, and we love to have you. And so I was like, okay, great. And you know, we really liked that church, but that pastor retires, leaves, you know, interim pastor during COVID, and then they finally hire a new full-time pastor. At this point, the elder board has changed multiple times and stuff like that. I sort of use the expression a new Pharaoh was over Egypt who did not know Joseph anymore. Yeah. And eventually one of the elders discovers my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And then I go through this whole process again. And it's just like, I thought I was safe at that particular church. I'd even been given something like a safety guarantee from the head pastor at the time. But I am at the whims and the mercy of the head pastor, it turns out, you know, like that. And part of it is like, they made a decision to like show me the door before they even knew the whole context. Like, I'm like, did you know that the head pastor knew all this stuff and that it was fine? And it's like, no, we didn't know that. Do you know that previous elder board members had known about my podcast and it was fine? No, we didn't know that. Do you know that my dad, who has the same beliefs I do, runs a Bible study and some of the previous elders of your church attended that Bible study? It's like, no, we didn't know that. It's like, yeah, you could have at least talked to me before you made this decision. And it felt like one of those things where they just made a quick knee-jerk decision at one elder board meeting without even giving me any due process or any chance to explain.
Out of fear. Myself. It sounds like it's out of fear and insecurity. I guess it does beg the question. There are, you know, oneness Pentecostals and other Unitarian churches. And I know that you've talked about this, but like, as far as for the context of this conversation, you know, and I think we even hit on it with some of your, you know, earlier history, like, you know, but it begs that question of like, there are Unitarian belief churches, and why not just, you know,
go to one of them,
go hang out over there.
The nearest one to me is like an hour and 15 minutes away.
Okay, well, that's part of that.
That's part of that. And, you know, have fun driving in a minivan with 3 kids, an hour and 15 minutes each way to church. And on the way home, you both have to miss lunchtime and the beginning of nap time. Right. So, yeah, like those sorts of concerns are real. Like, I hear what you're saying, but it is this belief is rare. And because it's rare, even in a city like Chicago that has every kind of church imaginable, it's still not easy to find one. And also part of it is like, I had maybe become a little bit more comfortable with some aspects of mainstream evangelicalism that I kind of liked in my exposure to that world. And there were many ways in which it was more comfortable for me in that kind of church than some of these other kind of churches. So I think that was the other flip side of the coin. So anyway, that forced me out of the closet. Or well, at that point I was like, whatever, you know, I'm coming out. I'm Sam Tideman, deal with it. Whatever consequences come, what may at this point, maybe it was a little bit dishonest to be doing this on the side. But the other thing is like, I asked the elder board after they'd already decided to, you know, remove me. And I was like, well, so how many videos did you actually watch? Because my channel isn't really like me teaching. I'm mostly interviewing people. It's not like an abundance of my own opinion. It's mostly other people's opinions. At least a good solid chunk of them are Trinitarians. Like, how many videos have you actually watched? You're accusing me of being a false teacher. On what basis are you accusing me of being a false teacher? And it's like, well, it turns out we haven't really watched any of your videos. Right. So, you know, like that whole situation was very frustrating. But I feel like
That's not dealing. That's actually, to me, that's not dealing with the issue,
Right.
regardless. It's trying to sweep it under the rug in a way, or just, because it is. I mean, I think that's part of the nature of what I experience here in this space is the attempt to hold tension, deal with tension. And that says even more to me about why, showing up in these conversations with people that believe in universalism and people that don't, and Calvinist pastors being your favorite YouTube channel when you don't like Calvinism. Yeah. Like I saw that comment on what was that on? I guess it was on Luke's little live stream yesterday. Someone said it, I can't remember, but it was well put. It's like, have real problems with Calvinism, favorite YouTube channel. Calvinist pastor. So like holding tension with these these things that don't quite fit nicely, and our culture doesn't tend to want to take the time to journey and go with that. And I think that's what's even unique about hearing your story, in the context of a journey, in the context of even, hey, I went to Willow Creek Youth Camp as a kid. My parents were Unitarian. Like, this is a real part. Like, these two things are actually a real part. Like, you're talking about the culture of mainstream evangelicalism and in theological beliefs. And you're like, actually, this was my formation. I don't know. I can't help that. And that's what I hear. And I think that that's interesting. I also think that the other pieces of just kind of finding your, why is the guy with, the struggling, little hodgepodge Reformed Christian church, have a successful YouTube channel and dealing with this? It's because he didn't quite fit into certain categories as a past, I think, the people that kind of have landed here that I see, that I look around, it's like, kind of, there are a lot of contradictions or something. I don't know if contradiction is the right word, but
TLC is a little bit of the basket of misfit toys.
Yeah.
There's certainly that aspect of it, and I think that's a big reason of why I'm here. Yeah. It's because I don't. It's a place that takes Christianity and faith and spiritual discussions seriously and earnestly and respectfully, but isn't closed-minded about it. And that's sort of a delicate and weird balance. And I think it's the sort of person who's drawn to it is often someone who's been looking for that but couldn't find it elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's I guess part of that. It's part of the ongoing conversation. The conversation. I remember Nate Heil saying that to me at Symbolic World. He's like, "Yeah, that's why you're being part of the conversation." Like the conversation.
There is a capital T conversation.
And I think that is part of it. And so, I think that's, I mean, I find myself here, I've shared parts of my story, it wasn't beliefs necessarily. It was decisions that I made that, I wasn't excommunicated, but being a pastor and then not pastor and kind of have it like being on the outs, so to speak, self-imposed, but, and trying to find my way into what that does. Cause you even talked about yourself, like what that kind of does psychologically is, no matter what the reason is, difficult, painful, and hard. And I agree with you. Some of the conversations that I've had on here, with one of the first ones, Justin Wells, and when he talked about Freud and Jung actually wanting to take confession out of like the office of the church and bring it into psychology, like take it away. And what you described in your conversation with Paul was like dealing with this, you don't like calling it psychological trauma, but you could, painful memories and kind of dealing with that with a pastor. Now, I want to be careful because I think that, my wife's going back to school to be a therapist. So I'm not like, I'm not like that. I just think that that's a real actual thing that, part of modernism has said, no, this is just, there's a wall between this and religion. This is psychology. That's religion. It's like, well, about the people, humans that have, struggles and pain that they need to, to process through. And that's not just a psychoanalytic, world, it's humanity.
Yeah.
And you know, so anyways, I think that makes sense that, you know, a pastor can help bring that and help
Bring it
people
back.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the confession genie escaped the church's bottle and went out there into the secular world. And
Yeah.
Paul, in a weird sort of way, is wrangling it back.
Well, and Jordan Peterson,
And Jordan Peterson,
he's a psychologist.
right. And I think that you're right that part of what was helpful and therapeutic, even although that word is a contested word in the conversation,
Sure.
but part of what was therapeutic about it, I do think, was that Paul was a pastor. And it felt like I was getting listened to in a way that I hadn't been listened to the first time around. And I even think that part of what was important was that he's a Trinitarian pastor.
Yeah.
That I felt like he was at least giving me a sense of justice that had been deprived of me the first time.
Wow.
And it's not like he got on his knees and was like, "Oh my goodness, Sam, you're right. I had never seen that Bible verse that way. I repent of all my, Trinitarianism now on the spot." Of course, that wasn't even the point. But the fact that he listened and heard me and understood where I was coming from and the challenges and depths of that was really mostly of what I was looking for, because I felt like I hadn't been heard the first time, and that was part of why it was like caught in my throat or something like that.
Man, that the power in that, I mean, that I think so I went through an experience where so when I was part-time at this church that I had been a part of since high school. I left, went to college, came back, and they hired me part-time to do music and youth, and so the guy that I was the pastor, in 2011, I made the decision to go full. That they always offered, if you want to come full time, and I'd been like kind of travel and do music. So I was like, I need to take better care of my family, so I need a more stable job. So I was like, we need to go, full time. So a month after I signed on, like he hired me, and the elder board hired me. He says, "Well, I'm taking a sabbatical," and I come to kind of find out it's because he's kind of losing his faith. This is 2012, and that's like right after peak new atheism, that was, I think, real, and
I remember 2012. It was a hard time for faith. Yeah. A rough season for belief.
Yeah. So it's like,
it was about my low point of faith too, honestly, but
well, that was Richard, God Delusion around 2009 or something like that, and it gets, that whole thing starts ramping up, and it's also right next to YouTube getting going. Like, as you were talking about, when I was on YouTube during that time too, I was watching the same debates, and
the millennial generation coming into their early 20s, which is also often a hard time for faith. So
yeah, well, he was mid 30s and I was mid late 20s, and so so he does that, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that whole situation, a friend of mine who I consider a sage in my life, he's about a little over 10 years older than me, and he was friends with the pastor. He had been fired because as a youth pastor at a Mennonite church, but his wife had cheated on him, and his wife was the pastor's daughter, and so it was like a terrible situation. He has this whole situation. He goes through a type of suffering, and they get divorced, and he ends up in the Catholic Church, and then he ends up in our church after that. And he gives me like this. He's always giving me these golden nuggets, and I couldn't understand them fully until I had to go through, some real suffering myself. But one of the things he said about this pastor was, he's on a journey, and the journey may not end with atheism. And I say all that to say, the way, like with this like tension with Sam the Unitarian is like, regardless of where Sam ends, it's like, we're on a journey. His journey may not end with Unitarianism. It might, but it's like, if you can live in that kind of like reality, as opposed to like what the elders did to you, which was we're not going to see Sam as Sam on a journey. We're just going to see Sam as like what he is like right now.
Or even a caricature of what he is
Yeah.
right now.
Yes, exactly. And so, and with our pastor, like he wasn't let go because of this. I mean, he was letting himself go, and then the elders were trying to like work with him on that. But anyway, so that was kind of when he said that, like, that's how it helped me frame how I view relationships even now with friends and people I'm meeting is we're not exactly completely just what we are in this moment, you know? And that helps me not, like you said, make caricatures, or not that I'm perfect at it, but, you know, see people that way. And I don't know, even in this space, like we both talked with Brendan Graham Dempsey, which is a whole nother level of interaction with faith, you know? And I think that was the thing about seeing him on as a person on a journey, not just as, you know, how his views on historical Christianity. So I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but that's how I'm interfacing.
Speaking of Brendan Graham Dempsey, I think another part of what was hard about 2012 was Bart Ehrman, and the rise of popular historical critical books about the Bible and the New Testament. And obviously, I think, you know, Bart Ehrman's books were selling for many of the same reasons that Sam Harris's books were selling.
Oh, yeah.
And that they were paired together in a certain kind of way. But I almost might wonder if Bart Ehrman caused more difficulties of faith for people than Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins did.
That's really interesting, because it was right. What happened in my life. So that pastor, you know, he quits, and after his sabbatical, and the guy that we hired was a Yale MDiv.
No, gotta be careful about those Ivy League grads. They're
I know. Trouble. I see him up there, the little barely showing Harvard, but he was a Yale MDiv, but super like Presbyterian, Reformed Presbyterian, Tim Keller fan. And I think it was so helpful for me because he had already like read, he came out of Yale more conservative than Yale.
That's fine. Yeah. Because Yale at one point deplatformed Tim Keller. He had been invited to give some really like their headline speech. I forget exactly, like one of those speeches that has like an endowment named after it, you know, or something like that. And he was invited probably in the mid 20-teens.
Yeah.
And got deplatformed or canceled or disinvited from giving that speech because of same-sex marriage views.
Right.
Even though it's like Tim Keller at like the peak of his fame, or well, probably because it was, you know, at the peak of his fame, but you know, that was Yale Seminary at that point in time. So to come out of Yale Seminary more conservative than Yale is not always easy.
Yeah. And so that was he really helped me through that season because I was, like you said, that insecure, like that time that you and I were both, you know, talking about for our faith. And it was because of, Tim Keller played a big role in that, but he had also, this guy, it was like they were polar opposites in the trajectory of these two pastors. So I don't know. That was a big part of my story. I wanted to ask you kind of what have been some of the more helpful or productive conversations you've had in this space that for you, like you said, that for this journey, this has been primarily about me, you know, about you. What have you had helpful moment? You talk, obviously conversation with Paul, but have there been other kind of seminal conversations that have been really meaningful?
I think one of the conversations that sticks out in my mind as being really helpful was a conversation with Brett Sockold. He is a Canadian theologian, a Canadian Catholic theologian, and he wrote a book on I think it's called The Eucharist. Like, I think that's the title, is The Eucharist. and he was an important part of the conversation for a period of time because he was on Paul's channel, and then I had him on my channel. And he is like just an excellent conversationalist, really kind, really good at listening. And we talked about his book. We talked about Trinitarianism and Unitarianism for a little bit. And I think that he really helped me think about the Eucharist in a new, in different way. And his book's main point is like, you know, when Thomas Aquinas was describing transubstantiation, the words trans and substantia had different meanings than they did when it came time for the Reformation to actually argue about it. Oh. And that a lot of people, when they hear transubstantiation now or today, even many, probably he would say most Catholics, don't really understand what he was getting at. And that, you know, words and philosophy terms and ideas can shift in their shades of meaning over time without people really noticing. And that by the time you get John Calvin arguing with the Catholics about the Eucharist in the Reformation, John Calvin actually sounds almost identical to Thomas Aquinas's points if you look at the substance, you could say, of their ideas, as opposed to the terms and words that they're using. And that in a weird way, the Catholics who are arguing against him are using the words of Thomas Aquinas, but John Calvin in many ways is using the ideas of Thomas Aquinas, and they both misunderstand that about themselves.
Man, and that's wild to me. So why was that so important for you?
Because I felt like it was building a bridge. I think it was building a bridge between Catholicism and Protestantism. It was like my church, probably like yours, was about as Zwinglian as Zwingli gets in terms of not thinking of the Lord's Supper or communion as anything other than a special way of remembering what Jesus did for us. And that there was certainly no hocus pocus, as we might have said, and no magic tricks or anything. We're just doing this because Jesus commanded us to do it. And it's like kind of like the 4th of July or Thanksgiving or something like that. Right. In terms of a memorial. Yeah. Right. And that I felt like Brett sort of helped awaken kind of a spiritual curiosity of what it would mean for something more than that to be true. And I think that that's been an important part of the conversation, is thinking about what the sacraments are. And sort of, because I think the conversation about the sacraments is almost even deeper than the sacraments themselves. It's how does our world relate to the spiritual world or something like that? What is the connection between the physical and the spiritual? What is the connection between our minds and, you know, heavenly reality and physical reality? You know, how do we do an interplay there, etc.? And I think that that's sort of one of the fundamental issues why people disagree about the Eucharist so often throughout history, is that it's really connected to that larger question of what's the connection between the physical world, the mental world, and the spiritual world.
Man, that I don't know if you know how like crossover that is with conversations that I have on this channel, but I spend a lot of time coming from a worship leader background, like thinking about telos and worship, and that, you know, really, you know, what is this focal point? Is it just a memorial, or is it like penult, you know? And and then the idea of sacred, the idea of these things, these sacraments that are these sacred practices that bind heaven to earth, like you were talking about. And but to put it back into like this Jordan Peterson idea, because that has been the way that he, you know, initially answered, well, do you believe in God, or the literal, you know, and his answer being, well, it depends on what you mean by believe. I want to act as if I do. And to me, you're talking about this mental connection to, like, what does it mean to like agree with what's happening up here versus what does it actually mean to practice my faith as if something's happening up here, and those kind of that difference where how you approach or attend to what may or may not be happening when we hear these words of institution or whatever. It's like the way that you kind of approach it changes your perspective on worship, I think. And it's interesting that part you said about, and I'm gonna have to look up your video with Brett Suckled and maybe you can share me the link. But
SALKHELD, Salk held.
Yeah, I really
I'll send that to you.
Yeah, but that has been a big part of my journey as well. My wife's family, she was born baptized Catholic and then became Lutheran. And all my conversations with my in-laws have been, a lot of them were sacramental and liturgical as a Baptist charismatic person. And the part about, so, the Presbyterian idea, real presence versus something being transubstantiated. It's interesting. You're saying Aquinas really that was really more about how in certain ways that may have been more of how he described something that was happening.
Yeah.
And I go as far to talk about how, when Luther created the solas, it was still like wrapped in this, it's not the same thing as a Baptist saying I'm a sola, this, because when he was saying that, there was still so much tradition and so much form and so much culture, and so much how they attended to these things that it's not the same thing. And so where we're at now, in this conversation is kind of trying, because as a Baptist, you could say you had the same ideas, but those ideas are in a completely different setting, So I don't know. That's how I've
how the meaning of words can change. And when a Baptist in the 21st century says we believe in sola scriptura, like Luther did, you actually might not believe in sola scriptura at all, like Luther did, in the same sort of way that a 16th century Catholic believes in transubstantiation, but they don't believe in the transubstantiation of Aquinas, or a 21st century Catholic. And I think another thing that conversation about the Eucharist helped me realize is that in many ways, the question of the Eucharist is very similar to the question of the divinity of Jesus, because it is the question of, so there's this physical human person over there. There's God in the spiritual realm, and then there's me thinking about him, and there is some connection that I'm trying to figure out, the connection between Jesus, this dude, and God in the heavenlies, and how I think about it propositionally, but also how that affects my faith and how I read the Bible, how I think about Jesus, how I worship God, and all of those things.
Yeah.
And that it's very much a similar kind of question.
I totally agree. And it's interesting. I think one of the things about this space, that most of the people that pop up, I think there are probably hundreds or thousands of pastors and professional ministers and priests and that watch a lot of these conversations, but don't feel like they can actually have them out in the air. And so what this corner in a lot of ways is a lot of lay people, non-paid, not career dependent people
with little to lose
in that regard.
Yes.
Having a conversation that probably has needed to happen in open space, about things, from all the way from historical Trinitarianism to the Eucharist to the charismatic, the whole spectrum, and without having to land back in almost into the ideological back and forth, but more, let's keep it up here in the kind of the questioning and the understanding, conversation on that. And that, I think as somebody who was behind that kind of threshold for a while in my life, I would have never wanted to come on and talk to somebody at the risk of something, but even for the layperson like yourself, you've you still did have something to lose, in regards to that, which, I mean, so how, I can't remember if I've heard how you have kind of resolved where you're at right now with,
it's unresolved. It's still unresolved. I tried going to that, the Unitarian church that's a little over an hour from me, but it is just too hard to swing with little kids. is really kind of the long and short of it. It's like, because you don't want to just go on Sunday, you want to have real relationships with the people there. And the whole point of me going to a Unitarian church would be I could actually do things and like be a member and be involved and not have barriers of entry in front of me, except there's a geographic barrier of entry because I couldn't, be a leader of that church because I would have to drive there, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And I just don't have the time or bandwidth or ability to do that. And like Sunday mornings is the easiest time to get there. Imagine having to get there through Chicago rush hour traffic, right? It would be even worse. So, like that was, I think, in my coming out video, right? Or my channel update video that when you watch, I think I mentioned that I was going to that church, and that was kind of true at the time. And like I saw that pastor last week and we're on good terms. So it's like there hasn't been any sort of falling out related to that. And he like totally understands the practical difficulties of the question. And so, I mean, my wife and I we're going to like a liberal church for most of the Sundays where we couldn't go to that other Unitarian church. And they don't care about the Trinity, but they don't care about much. And so, but my dad had grown up in that church. My dad grew up in like a liberal mainline church.
Yeah.
Had kind of a wild phase of his life as a baby boomer hippie, and then got caught up in this basically a wing of the Jesus movement that was Unitarian is basically. So my dad had a big born again experience with this particular flavor of the Jesus movement. And that was basically what I had grown up in, was what my dad had gotten born again into. And so, but my grandparents' old church. And in fact, I like when we started going the first time, the pastor was like, "Oh, good to see you, Sam. But by the way, did you know you happened to sit in your grandma's old pew this morning?" I'm like, oh my goodness, don't say that. I'm going to start bawling. But like, this pastor had done my grandparents' funerals and stuff like that. And like he knew I was right away. And it is comforting to go to a place where you're known and accepted at like that deep of a level. The only problem is like the liberal mainline church is a little light on substance, and then some of the substance that is there isn't very great. And but it can be I mean, it does have its virtues. I would say I think sometimes the liberal mainline church is kind of maybe overly maligned in this little corner, and that it does have a purpose and an audience. And I do think that God uses it in ways that are sort of surprising. And it's often as a soft landing spot for people who couldn't fit in anywhere else. And I just wish there was a little bit more there. But maybe if there was more there, then it wouldn't be able to do what I just said. So, I don't know. But we're exploring other options. I won't say what they are, partially because I don't want to get any of those churches in trouble. I'm not kidding in that when I've mentioned churches or pastors in the past, that has caused randos out there in the internet land to email them. So like, I'm not, I don't want to do that. So I'll be a little bit coy about some of the options that I'm checking out now.
It's so strange because in that description, you're talking about, it reminds me of this. I just finished up and I did a little partial live stream in the spirit of Paul Vanderklay on the Alex O'Connor and Chris Williamson conversation. Did you happen to catch some of that?
I watched half of it. It's Alex O'Connor frustrates me a little bit. I feel like he's Dunning-Krugering at the moment on so much of Christian history that I might have to make a video accusing him of being a Dunning-Kruger spokesperson. Like when he's talking about Gnosticism, I'm just like, oh, this is so cringy for anyone who knows anything actually about historical Christianity and Gnosticism. I'm like, I'm not saying that there is, like, yes, there were Gnostic Gospels. Yes, there were Gnostic Christians. It does date back pretty early, but he's doing such a bad job of explaining. He's like, oh, did you know that there were these books that the early Christians decided to not put in their canon? It's like that is like true superficially, but the superficiality of that statement is almost misleadingly false when you look at the, anyway, whatever.
Well,
I'm a little bit upset at him at the moment on that. But anyway, you probably had something other than Gnosticism to talk about that conversation.
Sometimes I do talk about, it kind of hits on this because I call it kind of a light type of Gnosticism, which is I think propositional tyranny is almost like a light type of, because it's only about up here. And that's kind of my point, that actually what they were describing, because they talk about how they're two atheists sitting there, Chris and Alex, and they're talking about that experience where Anya Hirsi Ali, who used to be one of the main atheist personalities and authors, becomes a Christian and comes out with that this year. And then she's friends with Richard Dawkins. They go have this conference or this conversation in New York. And Alex was there, and he said it was this moment where Anya's sharing her story, and it's very, gripping, and then she ends it, and everyone's like, "Wow, we're happy that you found this peace. You've overcome this depression and all this,
But do you believe in the virgin birth?
Right? And so you get to that point, and it's like, and even Alex, he's like, "Dude, like, is that the moment? Do you see the person?" Yeah. That's like a propositional tyranny that he can't let go of, Dawkins. And then Chris is kind of the same way. There's this idea that that's not the only part of a true reality of a person, is not only the ideas. Not that they're not important, not that there's not a conversation that needs to be had, but that when you talk about going to this more liberal church, you're sacrificing some of the priority of certain ideas, certain propositions for community, because that's also a real part of participation in the life of a person and as of a believer in these things. And so I think, and that those are the things we talk about, and even then how you participate. But then there's this tension again. You're like with the ideas, and it's such a.
Although I will say, it's not just the ideas that are some of the problem with the liberal church. Like some of the things that they do well, I love organ, hymns, and a choir in a beautiful chapel. And the liberal mainline church can still do that, and it is good. And I'm like, I just find that such a more enjoyable music worship experience at this point in my life than the Hillsong-esque more rock bandy stuff. I mean, I'm not going to criticize that too much, especially since I have been a guitar player and a worship leader in the past. And and part of me is like, I actually just like the songs that are like 10 or 15 years old better than the ones that are within 5 years old. Just maybe a generational thing, are already signs that I'm getting, gray hair. But honestly, I prefer a good, solid old hymn on an organ, the whole church singing together. There is no worship leader, and there is the choir behind you, kind of, which is sort of backing up the singing and making sure that the right notes are being sung by someone who's qualified to do so, but more just to strengthen the ability of the average person in the pews to also sing in tune. And with, a beautiful backdrop and stuff like that. And some of their newer hymns are god awful. Oh my goodness. Like new mainline liberal hymns, like so cringy. Like they'll start talking about like the environment or global warming or something like that in a hymn, and it's like not even pretty. It's just like ham-fisted and ugly, right? It's like, sure, like old hymns can sing about the beauty of creation, like this is my father's world is a beautiful ode to the wonders of creation, and like if that that could inspire you to be more environmentalist. But just like ham-fisted, ideologically motivated, ugly sentences awkwardly inserted in the middle of a hymn whose melody isn't as good as the old ones, like, ugh, right. Anyway, so but it's not just that. I think probably my biggest beef with the mainline church was that when you're going to, I'll say, for lack of a better word, a conservative or Bible believing church, that the strength of faith among the regular attenders feels markedly different than average people in the world. And that when you have community with them, you know that you are sharing that in common with them. And that allows you to have a depth of relationship, which is hard to describe to people who aren't familiar with that. And that at the liberal church, you don't feel that.
Yeah.
You don't feel like when you're socializing with the people afterwards, either you like, at the lunch afterwards, or if you're having dinner with them on a different day of the week or whatever, it didn't have that feeling that I'm used to of when you're interacting with people that you go to church with, that you have this extra level to your relationship that is the depth of faith that you share.
Are you talking about something kind of like a small group type?
Like
Bible
a small
study?
group? Yeah, like having a small group is part of that, or even just like, people that are in your church that aren't in your small group, that they're your brothers and sisters in Christ, and that provides something to your relationship. And like, I just didn't feel that at the liberal mainline church. I'm like, that's really one of the, I'm not talking here about like, I disagree about their ideas or I disagree about the way they vote. I'm talking about like, it didn't have that extra layer of warmth to it. That is one of the main reasons you go to church, is to have that extra layer of spiritual relationship and community with people.
The journey that I've been on, we, left the church that I'd been at, worked at, been fired from, gone back to, and recently in the last year and a half. And there was a group of us that were still part of we were still in a small group with people that were still there and that we were going to. But as the time went on, several of those people started to peel off, but we were still meeting as a small group. And one of our friends, they went to a considered more mainline liberal church, and for some good reasons. They're, one of their sons goes to church there and whatnot. And the guy, he was telling me the exact same thing that you just told me. Mm-hmm. And in we live in a small town. It's not like he doesn't know some of these people, but there's something about, he mentioned, like, he kind of put it in these terms, like, you just feel like in the more you talk to Bible believing church, like, there's that warmth of like, if you just needed to ask somebody to pray for you, like right there, that would just happen and you wouldn't have to feel weird about it. But in this other situation, it's kind of like, I don't know. I just want to walk up and be, hey man, I'm going through something. Would you pray for me? And they'd be like, oh, okay. Wait
a minute, you say you believe in the effectiveness of prayer and you expect me, just because I go to this church, to be the sort of person who's comfortable praying out loud? Right?
And I wonder if there's something to, like, cultural priesthood of the believer. I think there's something to that, and that's a reality. So that's part of it. But then all these tensions. But then you're like talking about this type of music and this type of hymnody or whatever, and that the Bible believing churches have abandoned in a certain way, and that the mainline churches are conserving. And like
there's a weird sort of way in which a mainline service looks more like something that you could have found 100 years ago than the conservative churches do, because they have experienced a more radical transformation in their church order and church service than the mainline church. But when it comes to certain ideas, is the opposite. It is weird, right? Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's not like the liberal mainline is in all ways more radically transformative. In many ways, it's more traditional. Yeah,
and I've had that conversation with C.W. Weeks actually offline a little bit, but because he goes to a mainline Presbyterian church, or has been up in he's up in not Milwaukee. Is that it?
No, Minneapolis. I believe.
Minneapolis. I'm sorry. I get all
No, it's okay.
the Midwest for
The
me.
upper Midwest. Yeah, I got it. No.
It's blurry. I'm sure like the South is. It's kind of. But yeah,
Arkansas is right next to Georgia, right? You know,
exactly.
you're basically, you live in Atlanta.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So yeah, that's the thing, and I think all that stuff that's in this conversation that that is hard to have because in your embodied life, because like you have to drive somewhere, go through a door, behind walls to maybe have a conversation or experience like this. But here, digitally, all that stuff kind of dissolves, and you're like, oh well, there's a Unitarian, there's a mainline person, and let's talk. Let's see what's really kind of at the heart of this or something. And I don't know. This has been really good. I know you were saying somewhere, we might be coming up on some time. I don't know where you're at on that, but
I'm fine.
Okay. So, we've kind of talked about why this corner makes sense for you or for us. We've gone through what set you on this journey, and some of one of the more informative conversations that you've had. Where do you kind of see? I mean, with your channel or in this space, like where do you think it's headed somewhere? Do you think it's becoming something? Do you think, I don't know.
I think that what I've realized is part of my goal. If there's a goal other than Sam's own personal learning, and maybe this is sort of like phase 2 of Transfigured, not that I would stop learning, but perhaps this is something like once my audience size is a little bit larger or something like that. And again, it's like, okay, so I have almost 3,000 subscribers. Yeah. Don't let that go to my head or something. That it's like, but I think that what I will probably have a couple big conversations with some more prominent Protestant YouTubers. It's looking increasingly likely that I'll talk with Gavin Ortland. Cool. And that's not like a secret. I'm not spilling the beans of a secret there. I mean, I've publicly invited him to conversation 2 or 3 times out there on the internet. And he's so far declined, but has decided to make some space probably later in the fall or winter or something like that. And so why would I want to talk to Gavin Ortland? I feel like what was partly cathartic about talking to Paul was that I felt like I got the treatment from a pastor that I'd been looking for the first time around. But I feel like I need to have a conversation with the I don't know, whoever is in charge of the egregore of evangelicalism at the moment. Like who is the manifestation, who is the current embodiment of that? And I'm not saying that Gavin Ortland isn't like super prominent or famous. He's probably mostly famous to young dudes who watch YouTube, and people of an older generation would have no idea who he is. They might know who his dad is. Yeah. But I do feel like in some ways Gavin Ortland is a little bit the spokesperson for the spiritual body of Protestant evangelicalism at the moment, or something close enough. And I feel like I'm owed a little bit of a conversation by this spirit, and that I have some bones to pick. And not that I would never be nice to Gavin, but I think that part of it is that as I've been going through church history, as I've been digging into these things, I think that I realize that this Trinitarian, non-Trinitarian divide is one of the oldest wounds in the church. And that there is, at this point, over 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years of trauma, I'll use that word again, around this particular question. And that I think that part of my goal is not to change Gavin Ortland's mind on the question itself. Although if he wants to, that's fine by me. But that would also mean, like, honestly, if I were to, like, through some magic of persuasion, change his mind, I would ruin his life in many ways. huge amounts of his audience would abandon him. His donors would abandon him. He would get fired from his job.
Yep.
He would have huge issues with his family and his church community, etc. Right? It would turn his life absolutely upside down.
Yep.
In many negative, terrible ways, which is unfortunate. You know, like if he came out and said, like, I'm a premillennialist now. I used to be an amillennialist, but I've been persuaded by historic premillennialism as my new view on eschatology. There might be some angry amillennialists in the comment section of that video, but it would have exactly zero negative repercussions on the things that I just mentioned, right? And you could imagine a couple other things, like let's say even if he changed some of his views on creation evolution stuff, right, which, as we mentioned, is a little bit of a touchy subject, he would likely not face any of those repercussions. Maybe some amount of his audience would unsubscribe or something like that. Maybe a small percentage of his donors would be upset about that, but he would keep trucking along and he might pick up some new audience because of that change in mind. So there are these big questions that are in bounds and these big questions that are out of bounds. And the Trinity Unitarian question is out of bounds at the highest level of being out of bounds. Right, like there are some things that are like that could maybe get close to that. Like if I don't know what would be a big deal. Like what's close to as big of a deal as the Trinity, but not the Trinity that he would get in trouble for.
Well, I guess that idea you can subdivide the Trinity into ideas about the incarnation, and so I think that's where like you kind of that would be part of that conversation, but which would be difficult. Because cessationalism versus non-cessationalism, or all these other things. I mean, weirdly enough, the sexual ethic would be something that would be a huge.
Yes, that would be perhaps one of the only other things that could get him canceled in a way that changes his mind on the Trinity is if he came out as affirming. And what's fascinating is there are so many times in my life where the question of the Trinity and the LGBT rainbow flag questions come up at the exact same time, as if they're like weirdly, strangely interlinked. I'm like, in my mind, like what two questions could have less to do with each other? But it happens all the time that, like, when I was in college, the reason why I was asked to sign a statement of faith is that there were huge arguments on campus about whether or not the Christian fellowships could remove people who were gay from leadership. And so my fellowship was like, we need to have all of our leaders sign the statement of faith. Sam can't sign the statement of faith because he doesn't believe in the Trinity, right? Like the rainbow flag questions and the Trinity questions happening at the same time. And a thing that's happened in my life, like at this point, it's happened at least 3 times. Where I've been removed from fellowship, and one of the people who was instrumental in that process later comes out as gay, and then tells me that they're sorry what they did to me. And I'm like, I need Jonathan Peugeot to dissect the symbolism of what's happening here. I don't. That
would actually be a really interesting conversation too. You got that one in the cooking in the backlog?
Jonathan Peugeot hates talking about the Trinity. It's like you can find clips of him saying it's his least favorite subject.
Does that have something to do with the filioque, like in trying to because obviously that's a piece of the.
It's obviously a piece of it, right? And there are sub-Trinitarian questions that divide Orthodox from Catholics and stuff like that. I think it's just like it doesn't have symbolic interest or something like that in the way that other things do, and he just views it as obtuse and annoyingly divisive and obscure, and not the sort of thing that he likes digging his teeth into.
I guess I didn't realize that.
Yeah. But anyway, I think Jonathan Peugeot has sort of written me off as someone who just likes to talk about the Trinity, and he hates talking about the Trinity.
Okay.
Someone else I think would have to shove us together at this point to get that conversation to happen.
The Gavin Ortland thing is interesting. Even in his Truth Unites, that's his kind of thing, is like, where do we find unity? And And he's done some hard work. He just got back from Europe, having that conversation with
the
an
bearded guy. And
Yeah.
what's he talking about the whole time as the source of unity between Protestants and Orthodox folks is Trinity, Incarnation, Nicene Creed, et cetera, right? And so what my goal would be, I mean, this is an absolutely audacious goal, but what's life without some audacious goals?
Yeah, agreed.
Is to open the Overton window again on this subject within evangelical Trinitarian or evangelical Protestantism, that this is something that is not a boundary marker between in and out, whether or not you believe in the Trinity, but it's something that we can revisit and think about with a new level of charity, where we don't burn each other alive, like has happened in many previous centuries. And that I think it might honestly be, you could say, the oldest divide in Christian history that still persists, despite some people wanting to ignore the problem of Trinitarians versus non-Trinitarians. Obviously, there's a huge lopsidedness in numbers, but there's way more non-Trinitarian Christians than people think. You mentioned oneness Pentecostals. There are a couple 100 million oneness Pentecostals. They're one of the fastest growing forms of Christianity on earth.
Right.
I mean, obviously, I think they're not quite correct either. But I do appreciate in some sort of sense that they are pushing the Overton window on the subject in their own way. And it's not just like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons either. There are way more non-Trinitarian groups than people realize that add up to tens of millions of Christians. So I think if you were to do a pie chart, it could be 10-20% of Christians broadly defined. Of course, if you define Christians as they believe in the Trinity, then you will find 100% of them believe in the Trinity. But if you define it more broadly as people who think of themselves as Christian, it might be 10-20% that don't believe in the Trinity, formally by denomination.
Yeah. On the Jehovah's Witness Mormon question that you just brought up, so I mean, the Unitarian Church of Christ is considered isn't it considered one of the seven sisters of, am I correct on this, of mainline Protestantism?
Well, the Unitarian Universalists, I would say that they are a mainline Protestant denomination kind of historically, but there's the United Church of Christ, which is technically Trinitarian, although they don't care anymore.
Right. So, okay, maybe that's where I was good. So then to the other point on, as a Unitarian, do you feel more connected to what's considered Orthodox Christianity versus something like Jehovah's Witness and Mormonism? Like, how does that distinction fall for you?
I mean, Mormonism is so peculiar that I don't mean to be insulting, and I almost never use the word heresy, like to describe someone else. I use the word heresy to describe what other people say about me. But after having that word thrown at me so many times, I just really refrain from using it unless I would really felt compelled to. Because, I mean, the word heresy, I think at its root, like when you look at what heresy originally meant, it's someone who changes teaching for the purpose of dividing the church and attracting new things to themselves. And it has this sense of division to it, not just like a propositional incorrectness to it. But Mormonism is weird because they have this whole other set of scriptures that they treat as authoritative. And so that is a huge distinctive, I would say, between them and other Christians. I'm not going to make some final judgment about whether or not they're Christian or not, or what percentage of Mormons might be saved. It might be higher than you think, people. But that makes them in an entirely different category of interaction to me, is because they have this whole different set of scriptures that they're interacting with. And so your base level of how you would even solve disagreements between you and them is different. Jehovah's Witnesses is interesting. It's a little bit similar in that they have like a special translation that they don't recognize any other translation. So that's like bordering on having a different set of scriptures.
Yeah.
But I think the main problem with Jehovah's Witnesses is their like authoritarian church structure.
Yeah.
and their oppressiveness of their own people.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is Jehovah's Witnesses wasn't always like that. It's really gotten that way since, like, say, the 1960s or 70s, that they've been around since the early 1800s. And for a large part of their history, yeah, they were quirky, but they weren't the kind of oppressive, authoritarian, controlling thing that we think of them as now.
Yeah.
And and there are offshoots from Jehovah's Witnesses that some of them even date back to like the early 1800s that exist too, that have a lot of their distinctive beliefs, but don't have that same sort of oppressive church structure. So I don't know. I think that, I mean, the weird thing about Jehovah's Witnesses that I think is the most peculiar and frightening in terms of what they believe is that they functionally believe that most of the people that are in their group are not actually full-fledged Christians.
Yeah.
Right. Like they have this inner,
they got the number.
Yeah. Right. There's the inner elite that are, and that the rest are almost like just observers, right? They don't get baptized. They don't participate in communion. They're hoping for some intermediate status in the afterlife that isn't the full-fledged Christian status. And that's kind of weird, right? That you have this whole flock of sheep that you're kind of keeping in this middle pen instead of the inner pen. That honestly is the most disturbing thing about them in my mind. But are they Christian? Well, they think of themselves as Christian. How many of them will be saved in the afterlife? I don't know. Might be more than you think, people. Be slow to judge. And I've met a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses that make great Christians and that take the Bible super seriously and know their stuff. There are some good things about Jehovah's Witnesses and their formation of their people. It's not all bad, or they wouldn't still exist.
That's
I guess
the part that keeps it together though is the once you get in, it's kind of what happens when you get out. But I guess I was trying to see, because it's interesting how you frame that from your own perspective of maybe in a way being on the outside of something, and there's these other people that maybe are kind of on the outside of something, but you're like, I don't fit over there for sure, and those are complicated. But I think it's gonna, I look forward to that conversation. And like you're saying, you're kind of talking about this Overton window and this trauma. When you said burned at the stake, that really made me think about symbolically, cancel. Like what are you doing other than completely canceling someone to the non-symbolic state of cancellation is, and so, again, I don't think that fits into the fractal down representation of what it means to operate in the world as a Christian anymore. So with that, how does that conversation happen?
Right.
This corner seems to be a space where, at least in some ways, it's happening. Because I know one of the most interesting things too was how, like, the conversations I've had with Hezi and knowing, and in Jacob too, like, is their affinity for the more monotheistic ness of your Unitarianism. I think that's interesting.
I think another role that I play in this corner is preventing the Overton window from closing, or preventing Christian orthodoxy from being, or historically defined as being, a litmus test. And that I think, because I'm that weird blurry thing that like looks like a Christian but sometimes doesn't, is that I prevent that boundary from tightening. And that I think that I do, in a certain way, help make space for Jews and other sorts of folks, because of me preventing that line from getting drawn too sharply.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about what is this form, what is this body, what is this thing, and there was a conversation on some other channels that I think that kind of happened before I got involved, about trying to formalize something more strictly, I guess. And what that would
interestingly, I was sort of I was very involved in some of those conversations and was for more formal organization at some points in the past. But I think that Paul has been shown right over time to not go down that path.
Yeah. And I think that's, yeah, that I was in a conversation with he's been following along the corner a lot, and he lives in China. He's a Chinese person. And
can they get our YouTube? I mean, I suppose he has VPNs or whatever.
Yeah,
but
he's I think savvy.
He's hacking around the firewall, to find us. But
yeah, and so yeah, we talked about VPNs. He actually told me after the conversation. I wish I had it on the conversation. He was talking about because he's in the States right now, and he was like, let's like he messaged me like back in March, and he was like, hey, let's talk, and or I said, hey, let's talk, because he had mentioned some stuff, and I asked him later after our conversation. I was like, how would this work if you're in China? And he said, we would keep getting cut off, and we'd have to restart because certain trigger words would get picked up, and they'd get around the VPN and they'd pull them off or whatever. I thought that was wild, but to the point being, where was I kind of trying to go with that? With people coming in, things not having super structure. I don't remember how I was going to connect that. I got lost on that VPN idea, but anyways, what part of our conversation? There was a part of our conversation.
Well, I was saying that part of the role that I think that I play is preventing lines from being drawn too clearly, or preventing the space from sort of collapsing into a standard definition of Christian orthodoxy.
Yes. There was something in our conversation, but just that there's people from all over, getting into the conversation that wouldn't be able to happen otherwise. And I do think that it's interesting how you said at one point you were wanting something more formalized, and then you've kind of come out of that and say, oh, this was where it was. Okay, that was the point. We in this conversation, we're talking about, Paul acting more like a gardener than like a gatekeeper.
Yeah.
And that's a great symbol for Christianity in so many ways. And how you this thing's going to grow, you just tend it, you care for it, you give it attention, but it's kind of, sometimes things are pruned, but that happens more naturally than it, but it's not, you're kind of just letting this thing become whatever it's going to become, and you want it to be healthy. You want it to be taken care of, instead of, that you're trying to control it or, make it into something else. I don't know, but kind of a garden idea, a metaphor for it, I thought was really good, more organic in its development than structured, I guess. It's not like if you're building like a chair, you need but if you're like planting something, it's I don't know. So anyways, that was kind of an interesting idea. It took me a second to get back there, so sorry about that.
Yeah, no, there's always the question of bounded set versus center set. Like people talk about that distinction, and I generally hate that distinction. Part of it is because it's like, oh, the Christian fellowship that I was part of in college, oh, we're a centered set, we're not a bounded set. Okay, wait a minute. Suddenly Sam doesn't believe what he thinks he believes, and all of a sudden we're a bounded set. It's like, oh yeah, all right, great. So you're talking centered set game this whole time, but really you're a bounded set. Because the question is, okay, so what's the center? What if people disagree about what the center is? Then all of a sudden you need to make a bound around the people who disagree about what the center is, right? Okay, so that doesn't really work, does it? If you have disagreement about the center, then you're no longer a centered set, and so you either have to say we're not centered, or you make bounds around people such that only the people who agree on the center are in the centered set. Yeah, so I generally don't like that framing. I feel like it collapses on itself, and it's never really as open as people think they are. the open-minded center set people, there's abound, and they're often hiding it or in denial themselves about what it is. And that's part of the reason why I don't like that distinction. But that's why I think your metaphor of Paul being more of a gardener, because where exactly is the edge of your garden? And a garden doesn't need to have a center either.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a better analogy. But I do think that my goal, however audacious this might be, is to open up the Overton window of conversation within kind of broader evangelical Christianity, to say that the Trinity and Christology is something that you can discuss and even disagree with historical definitions of in good faith within the broader context of still being an evangelical Bible-believing Christian. And that this doesn't need to be the lightning rod, throw them out, center of the definition of who we are thing, that you're making that, and that you're making a mistake when you do that, and you're reviving and continuing the existence of a deep division within Christian history. And that if truth unites, one might say, that you need to be able to have discussions about that, and that there are Christians who look far more like an evangelical Christian than you could possibly imagine who disagree with you on that particular point.
All right. I have 3 things, and maybe we can get through them, and probably need to start landing the plane a little bit. One was just that this YouTube, in the very nature of social media in a way, is well, so how do you cut somebody off? We're not in charge of that.
Right.
So there's
that.
They're
in the office adjacent to me, but
hey, there's a guy over, there's a channel.
Knock.
Yeah. So there's that. And then the second thing is oh man, I'm so bad at trying to hold on to these points. Then so there's YouTube, and then the last thing you're talking about. Okay, so another question I had was, how do you like something like the Apostles' Creed? Do you feel? Do you as a?
I love the Apostles' Creed. Creed is great. So
you okay? That's, and we don't necessarily have to go into that
word for word. Yeah.
But okay, that's interesting. And then the third piece, what was the third piece? Something about getting into the conversation not having to collapse or something like that. I don't remember. I guess we can land on the that you feel in good conscience that you can confess the Apostles' Creed, and I think that that's really important. And of course, even I guess I don't remember at what council the Filioque and which creed that kind of split apart from. But like I said, if I tried to go head to head with Sam on the
honestly, even that question's a little bit messy. It's a little bit hard to say. And part of the problem is that the Catholics and the Orthodox wouldn't agree on which of those were even councils. So
exactly. So, but the thing that's interesting to me is that you feel like I feel like that if we can say the Apostles' Creed together, that's very powerful to me. That creed has played a huge role in my life as a Christian.
Right.
And so,
but yeah, what you're getting at is what my goal would require of the other side is them agreeing that their Christian fundamentals don't include the Trinity, but that we can have a shared something that's even deeper than the Trinity. Perhaps it's respect for, sola scriptura, however we want to define that, some form of sola scriptura, some even respect for Christian tradition. It's not like I'm completely disrespectful of Christian tradition or that I give that zero weight whatsoever. And things like the Apostles' Creed, that's not in scripture, but it's a really super old thing. But I would be saying we need to agree on some common set of principles that we can work with together that don't include the Trinity, in order for us to see each other as something shared together that then can discuss the Trinity without breaking fellowship.
That I remember the other piece I was going to talk about but then what that kind of leads me to is something about the conversation I had with CW Weeks, but also then with Roy Clauser, is this idea of a shared Christian philosophy. That's kind of, what is that? That, and then the last thing, which was, so in this journey, trying to create some kind of a more of a relational connection to, I guess, mainstream evangelicalism or something like that, or however we would want to describe that. But then in that journey, how many people have you found that have reached out to you that find themselves in a similar situation? Like what has that community been like for you? And that, I guess.
Yeah. There are a lot of people like me who grew up as Unitarians of some variety. And then there's a lot of people who come to that conclusion personally from a Trinitarian background. And there are Facebook groups and other such things that are full of these people. And it seems to be happening, I would say, at an accelerating rate recently. I think mostly just because of the internet.
Yep.
Like people read a Bible verse, they're like, that doesn't make sense according to what I think the Trinity says. Let me Google it, or let me search that in YouTube. And then all of a sudden they find people who have different, more compelling explanations or whatever. And then that leads them to these Facebook groups or whatever, et cetera, after perhaps some period of exploration and thinking and journeying on the subject. And a lot of them have just very parallel stories of, getting kicked out of their churches. Maybe, some of them have like way worse stories than I do. Like, oh, I told my pastor that I was having doubts about this, and then he told my wife to divorce me, right. Or I was in ministry and I lost my job. Or I was in seminary and they kicked me out. Or I had finished seminary and they revoked my degree from me. All sorts of really nasty stuff. And this is kind of part of my point with Gavin Ortlund, is there's a lot of nasty fruit on the tree of Trinitarianism trying to defend itself. And this just needs to stop. There just needs to be a different way of dealing with these people. Because I don't know how I would put numbers on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if thousands or tens of thousands of people are going through this process annually at the moment.
How many of them reach out to you?
How many of them reach out to me personally? I don't know, maybe dozens a year, maybe not quite 100, but it does seem to be picking up. My audience, I think, is a majority Trinitarian, which is weird. Yeah. But I won't share any names, obviously, but I've had people who have changed their mind because of my channel, or have already changed their mind and then found my channel and then share their story with me and stuff like that. And, it's not quite 100, but it might be getting close at this point.
Okay. So what this is hitting on is this whole similar thing of why even across denominations having conversations, because honestly, some of those distinctives would have been, I'm not going to talk to you, or we can't be friends, or we can't even 30, 40 years ago, that because of the internet, and you hit on it, people are finding information that they would have never found 30, 40 years ago. And lots of it, and compelling in all sorts of different directions. This being one of them, is why it has to happen in a conversation. And that makes me understand why that conversation with Gavin is important, not for the sake of even necessarily who's right in a way, but because of what does it mean to even just have the conversation, as opposed to goodbye, you're canceled, you're this and that. And I think that's way more important right now than a right or wrong is. And I think that's what we try to do in this space. It's what I'm trying to do right now, is I'm not coming at this because I want to be convinced one way or the other. I'm coming at this because here's a person, trying to, that's, I believe, is a good faith, that's gone on this journey, that has been, found themselves in low places, in painful places, because of these things. I mean, the other story, when Luke Thompson leaves evangelicalism, he'd given his whole life to that thing, leaves,
Young
man,
restless reformdom.
yeah, this is painful. These things are even if you come to a conclusion that like these journeys are all stricken with pain because you come to this conclusion because you actually care deeply.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's hopeful in a way and important in that way is not, you know, I don't want to sound too postmodern on here, but you know, like that's kind of the nature of what maybe is kind of good about postmodernism in a way, is to be able to hold, you know, hold different ideas and evaluate them a little bit more objectively, I guess, or something. But maybe that's the meta modern, right?
Something like that. Like one of the things that I think might have tipped the straw that broke the camel's back, where Gavin finally felt like he probably should talk to me, was there was a public this was a public comment. I actually don't even remember the commenter's name, but he was like, you know, he told me, you know, some part of his story and sounded very typical. Grew up Protestant, but then was getting very interested in Orthodoxy or traditional Catholicism and found a lot of those YouTubers that we all know very persuasive. But then he started listening to Gavin and thought that his defense of sola scriptura and other Protestant things and his, you know, points about icons made a lot of sense. And then he's like, but then I started listening to your channel and my deepest fear is that you're probably right. But I am not at a place where I could admit that now.
Where did that get out to Gavin?
And I emailed that to Gavin.
Okay.
So I'm like, hey, this comment mentions you 2 or 3 times, even flatteringly, right? Yeah. There's more people. Like, this is a very well stated, well written comment, but this is representative of a huge thing that you should be aware of, and this is why I want to talk. And that comment is, I think, to me, where I sort of view my next shift is like, people need to be not terrified that I'm right. That there's something rotten in Denmark if that is the state of affairs.
And what does it mean, being right versus being that there's maybe right's not exactly the right word, as
I know what you mean.
But that there's something like within the relationship that, like you've talked about, that's really maybe the deeper thing underneath it. And I think that that's worth exploring. And so maybe we've explored it a little bit today. And yeah, man, I'm gonna kind of round this thing out, dude. Sure. Give you the last. I mean, you already kind of had that last word there, but I don't know if there was anything else that you were interested in.
Last word is Jesus and the New Testament are quite clear that Christians should seek after unity with each other and reconcile themselves with their brothers, even if their brothers have something against them. And so I suppose that's what I'm really trying to do at this point, is I feel like there is some disunity and some brotherly reconciliation that needs to be addressed, and that my pursuit is for that, and that my hand is open for that, and that this might be one of the deepest wounds in the church itself. And it's maybe time and the right opportunity in the right place to start trying to look at that.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for coming on and connecting more deeply relationally here in this space where we have both kind of found ourselves through you know, this kind of pipeline for various reasons. And I think that that's also important in this, because Peterson's kind of representative of that. So thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah. Thanks, Christian, for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you.
All right. We'll keep bumping into each other.
I agree.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in and staying with us until the end of today's episode. Your support and digital connection are truly meaningful to me. If you've enjoyed today's conversation and believe that these discussions bring real value to your life, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Your feedback and interaction are crucial in making this space even more meaningful. Also, I've opened up channel memberships on YouTube. By joining, we can foster a stronger community of connection and support the continuation of more conversation craft. Membership is set up to foster this in 3 ways. Level 1, connect via members-only community posts for channel feedback, behind-the-scenes moments, and supportive membership branding on comments. In addition, level 2, get to watch podcasts a week before they air, along with other unique members-only videos. At level 3, join scheduled monthly focused small group discussions with other kindred spirits from all over the world. Thank you again for being a part of this journey. Together, we can cultivate meaningful, supportive digital community right here in this little corner of the internet. We'll see you next time.